Good afternoon, everybody. I want to start by saying that I am deeply grateful for the opportunity to speak to you all today, and I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I am the daughter of a racing commissioner. When I was growing up in Virginia, my mother, Robin, was the chairman of the Virginia Racing Commission when Colonial got started. When I went off to college, I wrote a thesis paper on racing commissions and the regulation of thoroughbred horse racing. I love regulators. I'm a nerd for racing commissions and the very important work that you have done for this industry. And so I thank you for listening to an old hot walker talk to you about an industry that most of you in this room know better than I ever will. When I set out to write Death of a Racehorse, I had been out of the industry for the better part of 10 years. I cut my teeth when I was 16 walking hots for Ferris Allen as a summer job, and I went on to do a stint here or there for most everybody in Virginia that had thoroughbreds. I eventually wound up working for Gainesway and got a really masterclass education in sales preparation from Brian Graves and graduated from the Darley Flying Start program in 2011. I say all of this because I really want to emphasize at the outset here that I love this sport. I love the animal at its center. Of course, there is no animal more noble than the thoroughbred racehorse, but I also love racetrackers. I love horsemen and all of their eccentricities, their obsessiveness, their occasional outright weirdnesses, and just as often their utter genius. I love the patient husbandry in the mornings on the backstretch, and I love leaning on the paddock rail and making bad $2 bets on a bunch of platers. I have continued to feel this way even after I left the sport in my mid-20s and pursued a career in journalism. I work for CNN now, covering national security for a day job, and I can assure you that it is easier to get some of my literal CIA sources to talk to me than it is to convince some trainers that I know to speak to a reporter. I I set out to write Death of a Racehorse because I got tired of reading all of the mainstream coverage of some of the not so great parts of racing. Not because I didn't think it was deeply important that news organizations should cover the 2020 indictments or a spate of breakdowns at a top racetrack or the disqualification of a Kentucky Derby winner, but because I could see that through an understandable unfamiliarity with this incredibly complex sport, the coverage was often condemning the sport for the wrong things. It was unfairly tarnishing some parts of it while missing what I saw as the real problems, which were always more complex than can fit into a single headline. Plus, I just got really annoyed one day in the office reading a story that described betamethasone as just a steroid and left ordinary folks with the impression that racing was still using anabolic steroids. It wouldn't stop nagging at me. And so I set out to write this book less because I thought that I could solve the problems of racing, but because I thought I could act as an effective translator for the sport. I am a journalist, so my goal was not to be an advocate as a matter of professional ethics. That's not my job. But my goal was to provide a fair, accurate description for ordinary, non-horsey readers that would explain what was really going on behind those headlines that I just described. And in that way, I hoped that I could be a constructive part of the national conversation about the future of the sport. It was very important to me that what I write be recognizable to horse folks. That is to say, I wanted it to be accurate, but this is not a book for racing people. It's a book for the rest of the world. And that is a world that I can assure you knows and understands even less about the nuances and the sort of particulars of the racing world than even you think they do. When Ed graciously asked me to speak to y'all today, he suggested that I talk about what I see as the real problems, what's working, what's not, what I learned through the course of my reporting. I'm going to start from a premise that everybody in this room understands very well. Handle is down 50% since the early 2000s. The foal crop has dropped precipitously since 2008 and has never recovered. There is a broad understanding that some of that decline, although certainly not all of it, is linked to the public perception that racing has a welfare problem. Too many drugs, too many horses dying. There are reasons why evaluating the accuracy of that perception is an incredibly complex problem, and I'm not going to waste breath educating anybody in this audience on why that is. We all understand that the reasons for breakdowns are multifactorial, that there is no silver bullet to stop them. We all understand that it is, in fact, really hard to regulate therapeutic medication. It's really hard to make the decisions about which drugs are allowed, how much is too much, how long should the stand down be, how long should we penalize if we don't know how it got into the horse's system, how big of a deal is a positive finding. We all know that drawing a line between Good drug and bad drug is not as simple as it sounds, or people may think it is. Just look at the way the conversation around corticosteroids has shifted just in the 10 years or so since I've been out of the sport. So I'm not here today to adjudicate every single one of those arguments. After 2 years of reporting and researching this book, including quite literally endless conversations and debates over every single one of those questions. And can I just say, God, I'm so glad it's not my job to make those rules. What I ultimately came to believe and what I have reported in the book is that racing has been missing the forest for the trees. And it all starts with how the industry defines its core commodity, the racehorse. One question that I asked everyone who I spoke to for this book was, what is the thoroughbred racehorse? And as it turns out, that's a really hard question. They're certainly not pets. Participants in the industry make money on them. This is the basic fact of the racehorse. I know horsemen think of the animals in their barn as athletes and with great affection, but the racehorse does not have agency. He can't make his own decisions. While the horse certainly has parallels to a human athlete, the term, I think, misses a lot of the really critical elements that determine the status of a racehorse. Athletes are not bought and sold without their consent, and they may choose to retire or not compete if they are tired or injured. It's a little harsh to call racehorses pure commodities because, of course, a commodities trader doesn't have affection for a bundle of copper wiring or have to worry about whether it's healthy. But there are parallels here too. These animals are traded in the marketplace, they are investments, their value fluctuates. It's a really uncomfortable thing, I think, for the sport to message externally, but really these animals are livestock. They are an agricultural product, they are a financial asset that has to be kept alive and whose welfare must be balanced against the demands of the bottom line. I think the best answer that I got to this question, what is a racehorse, came from a California trainer who said to me, you depend on them to support you and your family. You walk around the barns many times during the day and you become friendly with them. But at the same time, on race day, you're putting them in the gate. And if that guy has to hit that horse 20 times to get you to the winner's circle, you don't really lose any sleep over it. So, exactly what are they? They're not your pets. This is the foundational problem that I came to see the industry as having, and one from which all of the little problems spring. So, stick with me here. Because racing makes money on these animals, there is an inherent conflict of interest with the well-being of the animal. Now, I know, and everybody in this room knows, that there are countless very, very fine horsemen who I admire, who put the needs of the animal first. I didn't write about the individual horsemen who are doing the very best they can by the horses in their care. I wrote about the regulatory, social, and economic system that they exist in and the little, almost invisible ways that that can harm the animal, the system that can lead even the best horsemen to make small decisions for individual animals that might not live up to the highest ideal of care. That's because, not because horsemen are unfeeling, but because in many cases, the purpose of the care the animal is receiving is not its health. It's to enable it to perform, perhaps perform more safely and more comfortably, of course, but the goal is still performance. Performance is how you earn money. Performance is getting to the racetrack. Otherwise, the horse would stay in his stall and he would eat carrots. I'm thinking here of commonplace things like the decision to put every sales yearling in the barn on Thyro L, the decision to try to get just one more shot of vitamins into excuse me, the decision to try just one more shot of vitamins to see if you can get an obviously tired and sore stallion to breed. The decision to put screws in a yearling's knee so he is more saleable at auction, even when we don't really know the long-term impact on soundness. The decision to try to squeeze in that joint injection as close as you can to a race because you genuinely believe that less inflammation in the joint during a race is better for the animal. These are little compromises that are everywhere in the industry. And by the way, they're not limited to horsemen. Every time you hear a story about the racing office writing too many races for a condition book and only letting the ones that fill go, thus making it harder for a trainer to safely plan an athletic campaign for the horse, that's the same problem. It's the profit imperative in little small ways taking precedence over husbandry of the animal. And that's why I write that this is a livestock industry. Okay, so why is that the real problem? We accept the use of livestock to our own benefit in this country. Cattle and chickens are bred explicitly for slaughter. They receive care to ensure they are healthy enough to be sent to market for consumption, not for its own sake. These animals, the horses in our sport, are treated like kings by comparison. And moreover, running livestock is not inherently immoral. It's the real problem because the rest of the country, and by the rest of the country, I mean the people that racing relies on to become betters and owners and ensure the survival of the sport, do not see the horse as livestock. They see the horse as fiercely intelligent, sensitive, a noble being. They see the horse as analogous to a cat or a dog. I often hear from racing folks that people just don't understand. They don't understand how well these animals are treated. And it's true that people outside of the sport perhaps do not recognize the amount of care and affection that these horses receive on a day-to-day basis from the people who care for them. But I've spent a lot of time out here in the real world since I got out of the sport, and friends and colleagues know I had this past life, and so I've answered a lot of questions over the years. And I can assure you, people do understand. They understand exactly what I just described. They understand care given to enable performance, not care given exclusively for its own sake. They understand the profit imperative in a sport that involves animals. They understand, they just don't approve. And that is why, if I leave the industry with one simple message, it's this: you cannot treat breakdowns or drug positives as a PR problem. The solution is not more positive stories about racing in national media. Those are great, sure. I loved Race for the Crown. But if racing doesn't bring its fundamental approach in line with society's broader expectations for care, you could write 1,000 fun stories about all the great parts of racing, and it isn't going to help get an increasingly socially conscious public on board and back to the betting window. The industry has to find a way as a whole, and I mean every state where racing is conducted, to better shield its core commodity from the basic and brute force of the marketplace. This is almost certainly a matter of writing good regulation, uniformly imposed. However that is done, we know some of the things already that work well. Increased veterinary oversight, for example, totally independent of the secretary's office, is obviously a big one. Moreover, regulation has to reach beyond the backstretch and the starting gate to cover the entirety of the animal's life. But the basic prescription that I'm offering here isn't technocratic or regulatory. Y'all are going to have to argue out all of the finer points of that yourselves. I'm not here to litigate HISA. The prescription that I am offering is cultural. It's a modesty of ambition, and it must infuse every decision from the size of the stallion's book to the writing of the condition book. I hearken back to the words of the writer and farmer Wendell Berry, who lived most of his life in Port Royal, an hour and a half northwest of Lexington. And he wrote about soil loss in 1991. It is lost a little at a time, over millions of acres, by the careless acts of millions of people. It cannot be saved by heroic acts of gigantic technology, but only by millions of small acts and restraints, conditioned by small fidelities, skills, and desires. Soil loss is ultimately a cultural problem. It will be corrected only by cultural solutions. I recognize that racing is already doing so much better by the animal, and I am, in fact, as hopeful as I've been in years. Fatality numbers have been steadily ticking down, and more to the point, I heard so many horsemen describe to me through the course of this reporting this book the little ways in which they themselves and their colleagues had been more conservative. This can only be a good thing for the animal, for the sport, for the industry. When I was 19 and I went to work for Gainesway in the Philly barn, I had the profound honor to learn from horseman named Jesse Herrera. And Jesse used to say to me, "I am good to the animal, and so he is good to me." That's the heart of the sport. It needs to be the heart of the business too. Thank you so much.